It was late October. I had been living alone in my aunt's old two-story house for nearly 6 months after she passed away from a sudden stroke. She had left me the property, quiet, ivy-covered home standing at the edge of town, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper with the wind at night. I wasn't particularly close to her, but it was a free place to live while I worked remotely as a freelance designer. I thought the silence of a small town would be peaceful. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first few weeks were uneventful, except for the creaks that came from the old wood of the house and the faint smell of mothballs that lingered from my aunt's time there. Every night, I'd make a cup of tea, sit on the couch, and watch the dim streetlight flicker through the living room window before heading upstairs to sleep. The house always felt colder at night, especially in the narrow hallway leading to my bedroom. I told myself it was because of the insulation. Old houses always had their quirks, I reminded myself. It was the 3rd week of November when I began to notice something unusual. At first, it was small things. A window that I was sure I had locked would be open the next morning, or faint muddy footprints on the porch steps when it hadn't rained for days. I thought maybe neighborhood kids were playing around, but the footprints were large, as if they belonged to an adult man wearing work boots. I brushed it off and tightened the locks on every door that night. But something changed after that. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, as though it had developed a presence of its own. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suffocating. I would catch myself turning down the TV volume because I thought I heard faint footsteps coming from upstairs, or the sound of something brushing lightly against the walls. Each time, I'd walk through the house with a flashlight, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Nothing ever appeared out of place, until one night it did. It was a Thursday evening, close to midnight. I had stayed up late working on a project, my desk lamp, the only light in the room. When I finally shut my laptop, I noticed the faint sound of a floorboard creaking above me. It was slow, deliberate, like the weight of someone carefully shifting their step. I froze, listening. Another creak followed. The house was old, yes, but this was different. It had rhythm, intent. My chest tightened. I turned off the lamp and sat in complete darkness, straining my ears. The noise continued, a series of faint, measured steps that moved across the ceiling toward the staircase. My mind raced for a logical explanation. Maybe an animal had gotten in through the attic vent, but I knew no raccoon could make footsteps that heavy or that slow. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed and crept into the hallway, the air around me sharp and cold. I could hear the soft, almost human sound of breathing above me. It was faint, but it was there. The sound stopped the moment I stepped into the stairwell. My heart pounded in my ears as I looked up toward the landing, swallowed by darkness. I stood there for what felt like an hour, waiting for something to move, but the house remained still. Finally, I forced myself back into my room and locked the door. Sleep didn't come that night. Every creak, every gust of wind against the siding felt like a warning I couldn't understand. The next morning, I checked the attic. Dust coated the floor, and the air was thick with that dry, stale smell of old insulation. Nothing seemed disturbed, no footprints, no sign of entry, nothing that explained the noise. Yet when I turned to leave, I saw something that froze me in place. A long, dark handprint smudged onto the attic door. It looked fresh, like someone had pressed their hand there with damp fingers. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a long time before shutting the door and pretending I hadn't seen it. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes throughout the house. My bedroom door, which I always left open during the day, would sometimes be shut when I came back from the kitchen. The lights in the hallway would flicker when I walked through, though the wiring had been checked only weeks before. And each night, around the same time, I would hear faint movement above me, slow dragging, almost like someone crawling across the floor. I started sleeping with the light on. It didn't help. The feeling that someone was inside the house never went away. I even called the local police one afternoon to do a walkthrough. They didn't find anything. One of them, an older officer who had probably lived in the town all his life, told me quietly before leaving that people around Willow Creek always said the old houses on that street had history. He didn't explain what he meant, but the way he avoided looking at me as he said it made my stomach turn. A few nights later, everything escalated. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard something that made every muscle in my body tense. A low thud came from downstairs, followed by another, closer this time, like someone had dropped something heavy on the floor. I reached for my phone, my hand shaking, but before I could dial, I heard the sound of slow, dragging footsteps in the hallway outside my room. They were heavy, deliberate, moving toward my door. I sat frozen, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. The steps stopped right outside. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the faint sound of breathing returned, just beyond the door. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't pipes. It was someone standing there. I could hear the soft scrape of fingernails against the wood, tracing along it slowly, almost thoughtfully. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I couldn't move. My entire body was paralyzed by the raw, unnatural stillness pressing from the other side. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, smoothly. Something in me snapped. I jumped up, shoved the dresser against the door, and backed away. The knob rattled harder this time, violently, as though whoever was outside had grown impatient. I heard a deep, guttural sound, not quite human, followed by 3 hard bangs that shook the frame. I stumbled toward the window, ready to climb out if I had to. But just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. Silence. Complete, heavy silence that made my ears ring. I stood there until dawn, not daring to move. When the light finally filtered through the window, I found the doorknob scratched, deep, fresh gouges in the metal, as if someone had tried to claw their way in. I packed a small bag and left that morning without looking back. I stayed with a friend in the city for a week before mustering the courage to return with a moving company to collect my things. The house looked exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. When the movers went into the attic to retrieve some boxes, they found something wedged between the insulation boards. A small, framed photograph wrapped in cloth. The image was faded, almost sepia-toned. It showed a man standing on the same porch I had been using, wearing work boots and a tattered coat. The back of the photograph had one thing scrawled in trembling handwriting. Still here. The house on Willow Creek has been vacant ever since. Sometimes, when I drive past it on my way out of town, I see the curtains move just slightly, as if someone inside is watching. I never stop to check. I just keep driving. I've always been drawn to places far from the noise of the world. Maybe it's the quiet I crave, or maybe it's because when life gets too heavy, I run to the wilderness, hoping to find myself again. That's what led me to Timberline Ridge last summer, a remote stretch of forest in northern Montana that locals often avoid. When I planned that solo camping trip, I wasn't looking for danger. I just wanted peace. I didn't know then that some silences in nature are not peaceful. They're warnings. I reached Timberline Ridge in late June, right as the sun dipped low over the horizon. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. It felt untouched, no tourists, no trails crowded with hikers, no buzzing of nearby roads. I parked my truck by an old ranger sign that was half fallen over, its paint faded and its letters barely visible. The last cell signal had vanished miles back, but that was fine by me. I wanted a break from everything. My phone, my work, the constant noise of people. Just the woods and me. I set up my tent near a small clearing, beside a narrow stream that shimmered under the fading light. The forest was dense here, trees packed tightly together, their branches stretching toward each other like old hands clasping in the dark. The first night passed quietly. I cooked beans over my small stove, wrote in my journal for a while, and then watched the stars scatter across the sky. It was the kind of silence that sinks into your chest, steady, grounding, and absolute. But the second day, that silence began to feel different. I woke up around dawn to the sound of twigs snapping somewhere deep within the woods. It wasn't unusual. There were deer, elk, and maybe even bears in these parts. Still, the pattern of the noise bothered me. It didn't sound like an animal wandering. It was slow, steady, spaced evenly apart, almost like someone pacing. I sat in my tent, holding my breath, listening. The steps went on for several minutes before fading into nothing. When I finally unzipped the flap, the forest looked the same as it had the day before. Sunlight cutting through the branches, mist rising from the ground. Yet the air felt heavier, like something unseen was watching from a distance. I tried to shake it off and focused on my morning routine, brewing coffee and heading toward a nearby ridge to take some photos. As I hiked, I noticed how the forest seemed to absorb sound. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just my boots crunching against the dirt. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. I came across an old wooden marker about 2 miles in. It was carved with initials and dates, some decades old. The wood was warped, the letters almost unreadable, but one carving caught my eye. It was a set of initials followed by the words, "Don't listen." I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just some dark joke, but I took a picture anyway. When I got back to camp that evening, I noticed small details that made me pause. My backpack, which I had left zipped shut, was open, though nothing inside was missing. My tent flap had been unfastened, and there were faint impressions in the dirt beside it. Too small for a bear, too large for any small animal. I felt a sharp chill despite the warm air. I told myself maybe the wind or an animal had moved things, even though I knew deep down that wind doesn't unzip tents. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the fabric ceiling of my tent, listening to the forest shift around me, the sound of leaves rustling, the creaking of branches, the occasional hoot of an owl. It all blended together into a rhythm that almost lulled me to rest. And then, through the wind, came something else, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the breeze brushing past my tent, but then I heard it again, softer this time, stretched and deliberate. It was impossible to make out words, but it was there, a low, human-like murmur that seemed to circle the camp. I held my breath, frozen in place. My rational mind tried to reason. It must have been someone passing nearby, maybe another camper. But I had hiked for miles without seeing a single soul, and the whisper wasn't fading. It was moving, closer. The sound lingered for several minutes, weaving between the trees. Every few seconds it would stop, only to start again on the opposite side of the clearing. I didn't dare move. I stared at the thin wall of my tent, the fabric trembling slightly as if brushed by fingers on the outside. My heart pounded, so loud I thought whatever was out there could hear it. Then, just like that, the whispering stopped. The forest went dead quiet. I stayed awake until morning, gripping the small hunting knife I kept in my pack. When light finally broke through, I stepped outside, my body trembling. Nothing seemed disturbed except for one thing, the trail of footprints around my tent. They circled it completely, looping twice before vanishing into the woods. They were barefoot. That was the moment I should have left. I knew it, but I didn't. I convinced myself I'd come too far. That fear was making me exaggerate what I saw. I spent the day exploring closer to camp, though every sound now made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard faint humming echoing from the trees, so faint I couldn't tell which direction it came from. By dusk, the temperature dropped sharply, and fog rolled in, thick and blinding. I decided to build a larger fire that night, hoping the light would keep whatever or whoever away. The forest glowed in shades of orange and gold, shadows dancing between the trees. I tried reading to distract myself, but around midnight, the whispering returned. This time, it wasn't distant. It was just beyond the circle of firelight, clear enough to distinguish as multiple voices, though none of them sounded right. They were stretched and uneven, like words spoken underwater. The sound circled again, faster this time, as if more than one person, or thing, was moving around the campsite. My hand shook as I tossed more wood into the fire, the flames leaping higher. For a second, I thought I saw movement, something pale slipping behind a tree. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. A shape, hunched and tall, with limbs too long to be human, moving unnaturally slow. I backed away from the fire, the whispers intensifying into a chorus of indistinct sounds, rising and falling like the forest itself was speaking. I could feel the air vibrating around me, the hairs on my arms lifting. The fire suddenly sputtered, sparks leaping wildly before dying down to embers. Panic took over. I grabbed my flashlight, swung it toward the tree line, and saw them. Figures, 3 of them, standing just beyond the reach of the beam. Their bodies were thin, almost skeletal, their faces obscured by shadows. But their eyes, if they were eyes, reflected the light with a dull, lifeless shimmer. They didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, staring. I couldn't think. I turned, stumbled into my tent, and zipped it shut as if a thin layer of fabric could protect me from what was outside. The whispering went on for hours. Sometimes it was close enough that I could hear faint breaths. Other times it drifted away like it was retreating deeper into the woods. When dawn came, I was still sitting upright, shaking, the flashlight dead in my hand. I didn't even pack properly. I just grabbed my essentials and bolted for the truck. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Through the trees and the fading fog, I could see the outline of my campsite, and standing right at the edge was a single, thin figure, motionless, facing the road. When I finally reached town, I told a park ranger what happened. He looked at me for a long time without speaking, then asked exactly where I had camped. When I showed him the location on the map, he exhaled sharply and muttered something under his breath. Then he told me, very quietly, that Timberline Ridge wasn't open for camping anymore. The area had been closed for years after several hikers went missing. Locals called it the Hollow of Voices because people who camped there often reported hearing whispering in the trees before vanishing entirely. He said they never found the bodies, only their tents, zipped shut from the inside. The first thing you learn about working the night shift at a hospital is that the quiet never lasts. It's not the kind of silence that brings peace. It's the kind that hangs heavy, waiting to be broken by something you wish you hadn't heard. I had been a night orderly at St. Helena Community Hospital for just under a year when things started to change. It was a small facility tucked deep in northern Pennsylvania, surrounded by endless forest and far enough from the main highway that, at night, the only sound that reached the building was the wind against the windows. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most nights were the same routine. I check vitals, restock supplies, walk the halls, and occasionally chat with the nurses when they weren't too busy. The hospital was old, built in the 1950s, and half of it was unused. They'd shut down the West Wing years ago because of budget cuts and mold issues, sealing it off from patients. But sometimes, when the rest of the building fell into that unnatural 3 a.m. stillness, I'd swear I could hear something moving inside that empty section. Soft footsteps or a gurney squeaking faintly across linoleum that hadn't been walked on in years. At first, I thought it was the echo of my own movements. Hospitals play tricks on your senses at night, but after a while, the noises became too specific, too deliberate. One night, while checking the supply closet, I heard the sound of wheels turning slowly down the west corridor. The lights that were supposed to be off, the doors locked. I remember standing still, holding my breath, as the sound grew louder, rolling closer to where I stood. It stopped just on the other side of the sealed door. Then nothing. I turned the knob even though I knew it wouldn't open. It was chained from the inside. Still, I could feel a faint vibration through the metal, like someone or something had bumped into it from the other side. When I told the charge nurse, she shrugged it off. "Old pipes," she said. "You'll get used to it." Maybe she was right, but there was something about the West Wing that felt wrong, even when I wasn't near it. The temperature around that area was always a few degrees colder, and sometimes I'd find the hallway lights flickering without reason. I tried to ignore it, but it was like the place itself didn't want to be forgotten. It was a Friday night when everything escalated. I remember because Fridays were always the slowest. Fewer patients, fewer emergencies, just long hours and the hum of fluorescent lights. Around 2 a.m., I was making rounds when I noticed a light glowing under the door to the West Wing. That shouldn't have been possible. The power there had been cut off. I stood staring at the faint glow for what felt like a full minute, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard something faint, echoing through the gap beneath the door, a sound that chilled me more than anything else. It was the soft, rhythmic squeak of wheels again, followed by a low, dragging noise. I radioed the security guard, Joe, who was doing his usual patrol outside. He laughed at first when I told him what I'd seen, but when I insisted, he agreed to check it out. 10 minutes later, he called me back. His voice was unsteady. He said the security monitors showed lights flickering on in the West Wing hallway. I didn't believe him until he came inside, pale and quiet, and led me to the security office. On the grainy black and white feed, the long, empty corridor of the West Wing was lit. One of the doors down the hall was open, swaying slightly. We both stood there, neither of us speaking. Then, in the corner of the frame, something moved. It was faint, almost like a shadow, but it drifted across the hall, slow and deliberate, before disappearing into one of the rooms. Joe swore under his breath, grabbed his flashlight, and said he was going to check it himself. I offered to go with him, even though every part of me screamed not to. We entered through the maintenance door at the far end, where the chain had already been broken. That was the first red flag. The air inside was damp and stale, smelling of dust and decay. The lights flickered faintly, powered by what must have been a backup circuit that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The hall stretched ahead, lined with empty rooms, the old signs still hanging crookedly on the walls. Room 312, 314, 316. As we walked, I noticed faint drag marks on the floor, like someone had pulled a heavy object through the corridor recently. The silence was absolute. No wind, no hum of electricity, just the sound of our footsteps echoing too loudly. We reached the open room we'd seen on the camera. The door creaked when Joe pushed it wider, revealing an old hospital bed against the wall. Rust coated its frame, and the mattress was torn open. I scanned the corners with my flashlight and noticed a medical chart lying on the floor. The paper was yellowed, brittle, but when I brushed away the dust, I could still read the name at the top. Patient, Eliza R. Henning. Date, March 6, 1989. That date didn't make sense. Records from that era should have been long archived or destroyed. Joe muttered something about calling it in, but then we both heard it. A faint metallic clatter from deeper in the wing. Something had moved. We turned toward the sound, flashlights trembling slightly. Down the hall, a gurney sat motionless in the middle of the corridor. It hadn't been there before. Its wheels glinted faintly in the weak light, and as we watched, it shifted, just slightly, rolling an inch forward as if nudged by invisible hands. My stomach dropped. Joe whispered that it was just gravity. Maybe the floor wasn't level. But when the gurney began to roll backward, uphill, we both froze. Then, something slammed hard behind us. The door to the room we just left. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence. Joe spun around, cursing, running back to check. But when he tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The handle was ice cold. We stood there listening, and that's when we heard the sound I'll never forget. Faint breathing, right on the other side of the door. Slow, uneven, and too close. We backed down the hall, flashlights shaking. As we passed another doorway, my light caught movement inside. A brief flicker of pale white, like someone slipping out of sight. Joe called out, but his voice cracked halfway through. We reached the main corridor and tried the exit door. It was jammed. No matter how hard we pulled, it wouldn't move. That's when the overhead lights began to flicker wildly, buzzing and flashing as if reacting to something unseen. For a split second between the flickers, I saw a figure at the far end of the hallway. Tall, still, dressed in an old hospital gown. Its head was tilted slightly, and its long, dark hair fell across its face. Every light in the corridor went out at once. The only sound was the faint squeal of wheels, the gurney again, rolling slowly toward us through the dark. Joe shouted for me to run. We stumbled through the hallway, groping for any open exit, the air thick with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic, like blood. I could hear the wheels scraping closer behind us, a rhythmic sound that made my entire body tense. When we finally reached the end of the corridor, Joe kicked open an emergency door that hadn't been used in decades, and we burst out into the cold night air. Neither of us said a word until we reached the parking lot. Joe was shaking so badly he could barely light a cigarette. When I looked back at the building, every light in the West Wing had gone dark again, as if nothing had ever happened. The next morning, the hospital administrators called a meeting. They reviewed the security footage, but the part showing the lit hallway was gone, completely erased. No trace of the feed we'd seen. When we told them about the broken chain, the gurney, and the figure, they said we must have triggered an old motion alarm and misinterpreted what we saw in the dark. Joe quit that day. He didn't even bother to collect his last paycheck. I stayed another month. I don't know why. Maybe to convince myself it had been some sort of shared hallucination. But on my final shift, just before dawn, I was restocking the main corridor when I heard the faint sound of wheels again. Not from the West Wing this time, from the hallway right behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Still, the faint smell of antiseptic and decay filled the air, and on the freshly waxed floor, I saw a single wet footprint, bare, small, and leading toward the sealed door of the West Wing. That was the last night I ever worked at St. Helena Hospital. They tore down the West Wing the following year, claiming it was unsafe. But sometimes, late at night when I drive past the old site, I swear I can still see a faint light flicker in the window that doesn't exist anymore. And if I roll down the window, I can hear it. The faint, rhythmic sound of a gurney being pushed down an empty hall. Every ranger I've ever known has at least one story they refuse to tell after dark. Some are about wild animals, others about people who vanish without a trace. But every now and then you'll hear one that doesn't fit either category. The kind that makes you realize the forest isn't just trees and shadows. It's something ancient, watching, and alive in ways we can't explain. I used to laugh those stories off when I first joined the Park Service. But after what happened to me at Black Hollow National Park, I don't laugh anymore. I'd been stationed at Black Hollow for 5 years when the incident occurred. It's a massive stretch of wilderness deep in Oregon. Over 300,000 acres of dense forest, ridgelines, and river valleys, so thick that GPS signals fade the deeper you go. My job was simple on paper: patrol the trails, log wildlife activity, assist lost hikers, and keep the park safe. But anyone who's done night patrol in a place like that knows simple isn't the right word. When the sun goes down, the woods become something else entirely. The familiar shapes twist into unfamiliar ones. Sounds carry differently. Your flashlight only reaches so far, and beyond that circle of light, anything could be waiting. It was late October of 2019 when the Park Service received a distress report from a group of campers near the northern section of the reserve, a place known to locals as Black Hollow Basin. The area was technically open but rarely visited. It was remote, off the main trail, and stories about the place had circulated for years. People said the trees there grew too close together, blocking the sky, and that sometimes hikers heard voices calling their names when no one was around. I'd always chalked those up to superstition mixed with fatigue, until that week. The call came in just after sunset. A weak radio transmission from one of the emergency towers picked up fragments of a message, panicked breathing, a few words about someone missing, and then static. I was the closest ranger on duty, so I loaded up my pack, grabbed my rifle and flashlight, and set out of my truck toward the North Ridge access road. The trailhead to Black Hollow was about an hour from the main station, and by the time I arrived, the sun was gone completely. The air was cold and still, kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I parked the truck and followed the narrow dirt trail on foot, guided by the faint beam of my flashlight. The forest seemed unusually dark that night. Even the moonlight barely touched the ground beneath the thick canopy. About a mile in, I found signs of a campsite, a fire pit, a half-collapsed tent, and a few scattered belongings. The fire was out, but the embers were still warm. That meant whoever had been there hadn't left long ago. I called out a few times, announcing myself, but the only response was the echo of my voice bouncing through the trees. Something about that echo sounded wrong, flat, like the forest was swallowing it rather than reflecting it. I radioed back to dispatch, but my signal was weak, just static. I told them I'd found the campsite and was proceeding with a search. Then I switched my flashlight to a wider beam and followed what looked like footprints leading deeper into the woods. About 15 minutes in, the track split into two sets, one heading uphill, another veering sharply down toward a dry creek bed. I decided to check the lower path first. As I descended, the forest grew even quieter. No insects, no rustling of animals, not even the distant call of an owl. Just silence so deep it pressed against my eardrums. That's when I caught the first glimpse of it. Something pale among the trees, maybe 30 yards ahead. I froze, thinking it might be one of the missing campers. I called out, but it didn't move. The beam of my flashlight shook slightly as I tried to focus on it. It looked human, maybe, but unnaturally still. I took a few cautious steps forward, and in that instant, it was gone. Not like it ran or ducked away. It was simply not there anymore. The space where it stood was empty. I scanned the area for several minutes before convincing myself it must have been a trick of the light. or a reflection off the fog. Still, unease had started to settle deep in my gut. I eventually found what looked like a collapsed sleeping bag near the creek, torn open, with the fabric soaked in mud. Scattered nearby were shoe prints, barefoot, uneven, as if whoever made them had been stumbling. The strangest part was that they stopped abruptly in the middle of the clearing. Not turned around, not continued, just stopped, as though the person had vanished mid-step. By now it was close to 1 a.m. I decided to follow the upper path to see if I could locate anyone else. The climb was steep, and halfway up I noticed something odd about the forest itself. The trees were growing in strange, spiraling patterns, their trunks twisted slightly toward a central point ahead. The further I went, the more pronounced it became. It felt unnatural, almost deliberate. When I reached the ridge, I found another campfire site, this one cold and long abandoned. A small wooden cross was stuck into the ground beside it, carved crudely out of branches. Hanging from the cross was a small rusted tag, the kind you'd find on an old dog collar. The name etched into it was Eddie. I didn't know anyone by that name, and there were no reports of missing pets, but it made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't explain. That was when the smell hit me, faint but distinct. Decay. I followed it a few yards off the trail until I came upon something that stopped me cold. In the hollow of a tree lay a pile of personal belongings, a torn backpack, a water bottle, and a park-issued emergency radio. I picked it up, brushed off the dirt, and realized it wasn't just any radio. It was one of ours. I checked the serial number. It belonged to Ranger Tom Halden. Tom had gone missing the previous year. Everyone assumed he drowned after his truck was found near the river, though his body was never recovered. The idea that his radio was here, miles from where he was last seen, made no sense. I turned it over in my hands and noticed something carved faintly into the plastic casing. 3 vertical lines followed by a horizontal slash across them, like a tally mark. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that mark before I heard it. The faint sound of someone whispering my name. It came from deep within the trees, soft and breathy, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I froze. The voice came again, closer this time, saying my name with an eerie familiarity, almost tender. It was Tom's voice. I knew it instantly. I'd worked with him for years, but that was impossible. My mouth went dry as I turned slowly, scanning the darkness. Tom. I wanted to say it out loud, but no sound left my throat. The forest around me had gone completely still again, as though holding its breath. Then, about 20 feet away, a faint glow appeared, like the beam of another flashlight, but dimmer, pulsing slightly. It hovered there, unmoving. I started toward it, thinking maybe, just maybe, there was someone alive out there. But with each step I took, the glow receded, leading me deeper into the trees. Soon, the terrain shifted into uneven ground, fog thickening until I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The light stopped near a clearing and flickered out completely. I raised my flashlight, and that's when I saw them. Rows of crude wooden crosses, half buried in the ground, stretching into the fog. Some were broken, others freshly placed, the soil beneath them disturbed. My knees felt weak. I counted at least 15, maybe more. None of them had names, just the same carved mark I'd seen on Tom's radio. 3 lines with 1 slash through them. The wind picked up then, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong. Not animal, not human. A low, hollow moan that seemed to rise from beneath the ground itself. The trees swayed violently, though there was no storm. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement between the graves, something crawling, pale and slow. I ran. I didn't look back. By the time I reached my truck, dawn was breaking. The forest looked peaceful again, untouched, like none of it had happened. I drove straight to the main ranger station, mud-caked and shaking. When I reported what I'd seen, my supervisor told me to take a few days off. He said the area had a history, that it wasn't the first time rangers had reported strange activity there. Later that day, I went back with full team. We hiked to the same coordinates I had marked, but when we got there, the clearing was gone. The trees stood differently. The creek had shifted course, and there were no crosses, no graves, no signs of disturbance at all. Even the footprints I had left were missing, as if the forest had swallowed every trace of that night. We did, however, find something near the old campsite by the ridge. Embedded in the dirt was a small, rusted name tag, the same kind from the first cross I'd found. The name on it read, Tom. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years, and I've seen almost everything a man can see on the open road. Accidents, strange weather, wild animals, and people who shouldn't be out past midnight. But nothing compares to what I experienced one winter night on Route 117, a stretch of highway in northern Wyoming that seems to swallow the light itself once the sun goes down. It was late January, the kind of night where the air freezes your breath and the wind howls across the plains like it's alive. I was hauling a refrigerated trailer full of produce from Billings to Denver. I had driven that route hundreds of times before, and I always try to make it past the mountain stretch before midnight, because once the fog rolls in up there, you can barely see your own headlights. But that night, I was running behind schedule. I had stopped earlier for fuel and a quick meal at a truck stop outside of Sheridan. The clerk behind the counter, an older woman with a raspy voice, warned me about black ice forming past the old mining town near the pass. I nodded, thanked her, and got back on the road, not thinking much of it. I'd driven through worse, but I remember her tone. It wasn't casual. It was the kind of voice that carried weight, like she was trying to warn me about something deeper than road conditions. By the time I reached Route 117, the snow had started falling again, thin flakes swirling through the beams of my headlights. The road was almost empty, except for the occasional pair of taillights far ahead that disappeared into the night. I turned off the radio and focused on the hum of the engine. There was a kind of peace in it, that steady rhythm that keeps your thoughts quiet. For a while, everything was fine. Then, just past mile marker 132, I saw something lying in the middle of the road. It looked like a piece of tarp at first, black, tangled, unmoving. I slowed down, thinking maybe something had fallen off another truck. As I got closer, the shape began to take form. It wasn't a tarp. It was a man's coat, and there was still someone wearing it. I slammed on the brakes, tires skidding across the ice, and stopped about 20 feet away. The figure didn't move. The snow was blowing hard now, and visibility was getting worse by the second. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my gloves, and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the frozen pavement. When I reached the man, I could tell he wasn't alive. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were open, staring up at the sky as if frozen in shock. His clothes were soaked and torn, and his hands looked like they'd been scraping at the asphalt. I didn't see any blood, no sign of an accident, just that strange, lifeless stillness. I was about to call the police when I noticed something else. Faint footprints leading away from a body into the snow-covered trees beside the road. They weren't deep, almost as if whoever made them had been dragging their feet, half crawling, half walking. My flashlight flickered across the tree lane, but there was only darkness beyond the first few pines. The sound of the wind seemed to change there, lower, more deliberate, like it was echoing from inside something hollow. I backed up slowly, went back to my truck, and locked the doors. I radioed dispatch and told them what I found, giving my location and waiting for a response. They told me to stay put and that local law enforcement was on their way. I turned on my hazard lights and sat in silence, watching the snow pile against the windshield. But then I heard it, a faint thump, like something hitting the back of the trailer. Just once. I thought maybe the wind had pushed debris against it. But then it came again, louder, a steady, dull impact that made the entire truck shudder slightly. My first thought was that someone might be trying to climb onto the trailer, maybe a hitchhiker, or worse. I turned the engine off and listened. The sound stopped. I sat there for a long time, staring at the mirrors, waiting to see movement. But the only thing I could see was the reflection of my own hazard lights blinking red against the fog. I was starting to convince myself it had been the wind when my CB radio crackled, even though dispatch had already signed off. The voice that came through wasn't anyone from the company. It was faint, distorted by static, but I could make out the words, "You should have kept driving." I froze, staring at the radio. I reached for the mic and tried to respond, but before I could speak, a loud bang hit the side of the cab, so hard it made me flinch. I started the engine immediately, ready to move, but something made me glance out the passenger side window first. Standing just beyond the edge of the headlights was a figure. It looked like the man I'd found on the road, but now he was standing, his head tilted slightly, as if he were studying the truck. His clothes hung in tatters, and one of his arms looked twisted, like it had been broken. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, half in shadow, the snow swirling around him. I hit the gas and took off, not looking back. The trailer fishtailed slightly as I pushed past the curve, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the mirror. Someone running alongside the truck. The road ahead twisted through a narrow stretch between the cliffs, and the snow grew heavier, blanketing everything in white. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat as I forced myself to focus on the road. When I finally reached the next rest area, I pulled in fast and parked under the light near the entrance. The lot was empty except for an old pickup truck and a vending machine flickering by the bathroom door. I stepped out, my breath coming out in clouds, and checked the back of the trailer. There were handprints, dark, wet handprints, smeared across the metal door. They trailed down toward the bumper like someone had been clinging to it while I was driving. I stayed there until a state trooper arrived about half an hour later. He listened to my story, checked the road where I'd seen the body, and came back with a look I'll never forget. He said there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign of a man, no body, just tire tracks and untouched snow. He must have thought I was tired or hallucinating from a long haul. I didn't argue. The strangest part, though, came when I returned to the truck the next morning after catching some sleep at a motel. There was something written in the frost on the inside of my windshield, faint but unmistakable. Keep driving. I tried to tell myself maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone at the motel had done it. But the handwriting looked wet, like it had been drawn with a bare finger. I don't take Route 117 anymore. I go an extra 100 miles out of my way just to avoid it. Every driver who's been in this business long enough has one stretch of road they'll never go down again. That one's mine. Sometimes, late at night when I'm halfway between towns and the radio cuts to static, I still hear that same faint voice over the CB, broken by static, barely a whisper.